first point I'd really like to make is it is the 100th anniversary this year of the first World War, the first great inter-imperialist conflict. Britain declared war on the 4th of August, so the anniversary here really is connected with that date. But the first point I'd like to make is that a sequence of events is not the same thing as course of events. I'd like to count these sequence of events just very, very quickly, because these are going to be coming all the time, and people will be plaguing you who started the war, when, what happened. Of course, the earliest start that is given to the war is 28th of June 1914, when a Serbian nationalist shot dead the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they said, well, this is really what started the war. Well, there are plenty of aristocrats who are killed from time to time. They need not give rise to a war, let alone a world war. And then on the 23rd of July, that's about 3 weeks after this shooting incident, the Austrian government issued an ultimatum to Serbia to apologize and hand over the people who committed this assassination. And 5 days later, the Austrians mobilized for war, and they opened fire on Belgrade. 2 days after that, the Russian Tsar ordered his army to be mobilized, because Russia was an ally of Serbia. And Russians are always considered all the Slavs were, if you like, his slaves, that he had a right to protect the Slavs. They were fellow Slavs. On the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. They only ordered the mobilization of their army, but Germany declared war because Germany was very worried at that time that the triple entente of Britain, Russia and France would be too powerful, and they should really indulge in a preemptive strike, so that they didn't really want to face the war on 2 fronts. And if they thought they could knock out their enemies on the Western Front, they'd be able to deal with the war on the Eastern Front against Russia. So that happened on the 1st. And on the 2nd of August, the Russian Tsar declared war. The Russian Tsar was very keen to declare war, as indeed was the German government, because both countries and the French, these 3 countries had tremendous working class turnout. There were revolutionary movements going on. The most important, of course, were Russia and Germany, but also to a certain extent France. And you would remember, just before the war started, left-wing socialist Jaurès was shot dead by a right-wing person because he'd been mobilizing against the war. There were mobilizations of the working class in all the imperialist countries against war. And of course, the war immediately had the effect of helping the ruling class, that instead of fighting against their own ruling class, a huge amount of patriotic sentiment took over. And so the Tsar thought that by declaring the war, not only would they be able to deal with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they would also be able to squash the rising working class movement in Moscow and Petersburg. Then on the 3rd of August, France, France went to war, and a day later, Britain joined the war. So that's really the sequence of events, but none of them constitute the reasons for it. I'll come to the reasons for the war. And on the 4th of August, something more disgusting than any of these things happened. The Reichstag, the German parliament, voted for war crimes. It was a unanimous resolution, and it included the votes of 110 social democratic deputies. Communists those days were called social democrats. The Social Democratic Party of Germany basically went wholesale over to its bourgeoisie and decided to fight for the defense of the German fatherland, i.e. sanctioning soldiers going from Germany to slaughter fellow workers from the other side, as indeed the other Imperialist country did. The war, when it took place, was a horrendous war. It was the first war where industrial scale killing took place. Science, communication, technology, and mass mobilization of armies had seen to it that it would be a tremendous holocaust. By the time the war ended, 16 million people had died in that war, and many more had been injured, maimed, and colossal amounts of wealth of society destroyed. There were days in the battle when on a single day, the armies of single national countries who were combatants in it lost anything from 16 to 20,000. In one day, for example, the French lost 24,000 soldiers in a battle, and Britain lost 20,000 in the Battle of Somme in just literally one day. There were 5 days in the war, and in the middle of 16, when in those 5 days, the French lost 120,000 men. Now you divide that, 120,000 by 5, and you can see the scale of that war. For Britain, this was the most costly war in terms of human beings, not just material resources. Britain has never lost that many personnel in any war. Britain lost nearly 900,000 of British proper soldiers, if you like, okay, and many more were injured and maimed. But of course it mobilized colonial peoples as well. Indians contributed hundreds of thousands, and Britain's casualties in that war, if you include the colonial soldiers as well, were close to 2 million. So it was a war which was horrendous, which claimed a lot of people. But this war, when you take the casualties of the Second World War, again pales into insignificance. Because the casualties in the Second World War on the European front was 60 million. You know, if the First World War claimed 16 million, the Second World War claimed 60 million. That is not including what the Chinese suffered fighting against the Japanese and all the war. The estimates are difficult to make, but they are anywhere between 25 to 30 million. The Chinese lost. Everybody knows that the Soviet Union lost between 27 to 30 million soldiers in the Second World War. But the Chinese lost in equal number, and it's not a fact which is very well known, and we need to remember the contribution made by the Chinese in fighting against Japanese imperialism and fascism. They were fighting in the Far East, and of course there are other people who fought. The Koreans fought and lost a lot of people. Now, when it comes to war, as Lenin never ceased to point out, we need to discuss war, not only because it's the 100th anniversary of the first great imperialist slaughter, also because war is all around us. There has not been a single day since the Second World War when the world has known peace completely, there hasn't been some corner of the world which is not endowed by the war. Yes, there hasn't been a war between the great powers, if you like, since the Second World War. And people in Europe forget that they say, there's been peace since the Second World War. Not peace for everybody. No sooner had the Second World War finished than the Americans waged the Korean War, in which they killed 4 million Korean people. And the Korean War was soon followed by the war in Vietnam and other Indo-Chinese countries, and again 4 to 5 million people were done to death by saturation bombing and by spraying of Agent Orange and dropping off all kinds of bombs, which were really chemical warfare. Now they will tell you that this chemical warfare was banned after the First World War, and the Syrian regime is a horrible regime because it uses chemical weapons, and they make all kinds of fake stories. And the fact of the matter is, the Americans used it on an industrial scale in the Vietnam War, and have used uranium-tipped weapons in the Iraq War, and they continue to do that in Afghanistan as well. So war is everywhere, and all the controversies about war become futile because, as I said, Lenin said, people forget the fundamental question of the class character of the war, why the war broke out, the classes that are waging it, the historical and historical economic conditions that gave rise to the war. If you really want to know what a war is about, why it took place, what were the historical conditions, you must ask yourself the question of the class character of the war. What is the war being waged for? Is it a war of liberation, or is it a war for loot and for oppressing other people? Lenin again was very fond of citing a famous dictum of a German war historian, Clausewitz, who made the profound statement that war is a continuation of policy by other, more violent means. War is not something that is separated from peace. It's not something that you can separate from peace. This is peace and this is war. War is a continuation of a policy that was pursued in peaceful times, but obviously it came to the end of the tether. It could no longer be pursued by peaceful means, and therefore it had to be carried on by more violent means. And when war makes for peace, it's not something separated from the war, it's a continuation of war. It simply continues the same as was continued during the wartime, only it registers the changes that took place as a result of the war, the movement of the armies, who won, who was a victorious from that war. So there's an indissoluble connection between a policy that is pursued prior to the war and the war itself. There is an indissoluble economic and historical connection between every war and the policy preceding it. Each class that was in power before the war and achieved its aim by so-called peaceful means. Undoubtedly, there would have been no First World War if France and Britain had said to Germany, we had a good time exploiting the colonies and spheres of influence and avenues for investment. You come a bit late in the field, you can have some of ours. But that's not really what happens. That's precisely why we have to really decide the causes of the war and what gave rise to it by not asking the question who was the one to fire the first shot, whether it was the Serbian nationalist or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or Germany or Britain or France or Russia. You have to ask yourself what were they doing prior to war, all of them. We must look at the substance of the war. Is the substance of the war to overthrow alien oppression, or is it for the redivision and plunder of the wealth and for deciding which one of the combatants shall have what share of the loot, the colonies, avenues of investment, sources of raw materials, and markets, of course. But the other thing that needs to be said is war is not an aberration. War is normal business under the conditions of capitalism, especially in its stage of highest development, namely monopoly capitalism. War is like business, like you produce clothes for ladies, you also prepare for war. War is normal business. War comes because under the conditions of crisis, imperialist powers cannot deal with the situation in the normal way. So they resort to war. War is literally the epitome of imperialist politics. And there's no question that capitalism's transition from the stage of free capital, free competition capital to monopoly state is connected with the intensification of the struggle for the partition of the world. If you remember the historical events, toward the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s, there was a conference. It was called the Berlin Congress. And at that Berlin Congress, the various imperialist powers sat around a table and basically marked with a pen areas of Africa which will go to different imperialist powers. Little Belgium, whose neutrality was supposed to have been violated by the German attack and therefore provided the raison d'etre for Britain declaring war in defense of Belgian democracy and Belgian neutrality. Little Belgium was granted the huge territory of Congo. Congo is really at the center and heart of Africa, and the curse of the Congolese people has been they are very rich in mineral resources. And before Belgium's neutrality and democracy had been violated by the Germans, they had just finished killing 10 million Congolese. This is not a fact which is mentioned by war historians very often. So Belgium is just described as a poor little innocent thing, and the German brutal imperialists came and violated that neutrality and destroyed beautiful cities like Louvain and whatnot. What the Belgians have been doing is nobody's concern. So Belgium got Congo. Germany was given a few peripheral places like Cameroon and Uganda and Tanganyika, etc. The biggest share went to the biggest thieves, i.e. Britain and France. And of course, the biggest of these two was Britain. So they carved up these territories. But this was the last time that the imperialist powers would be able to sit down around a table and peacefully divide the world. Because there were areas of the world which were uninhabited. Not uninhabited that there were no local people. Uninhabited in the sense that they were not occupied by any of the colonialist and imperialist powers. But after that, you have the transition from free competition capitalism to monopoly capitalism, and the partition of 1880s was based on the relative power, economic and military power of the powers that were dividing Africa. But within 20 years of that Congress taking place, that power balance had changed. Germany had come from nowhere to overtake Britain in industrial production and also started building its armies. It started building its navy, because to compete with Britain, you had to have naval strength as well. Britain was the most important and most powerful naval state at that particular time. So Germany was building. So Germany, if you like, came to the imperialist banqueting table a little late, when all the seats around it were occupied. Now, among friends, if you go to somebody's house and there's a party and there are not enough seats and people are sitting there, they've been sitting there for 2-3 hours, and you go there and say, no, come on James, you can come and sit down, I've been sitting there. But that's not what imperialists do. They've been old imperialist power, decrepit, sated, have been gorging at the imperialist table of loot for decades, if not for centuries. They're not going to give up. They say it's lawfully ours. Then comes a robust young robber, namely Germany, and they say, what about us? This is not fair. In the world of slaveholders, if you've got fewer slaves than your rivals, you say it's not fair because I haven't got as many slaves as you've got. So when they demanded their share, Britain and France said, this is ours by law. He said, what is the law? You conquered them by sword and shield. Well, we can take them from you by sword and shield as well. And so in the world of capital, in the final analysis, these things can only be decided by war. And that's really why the war took place. It had nothing to do with human rights. It had nothing to do with liberation. It had nothing to do with violation of Belgium's neutrality. It had nothing to do with defending Serbia, if you like. It was a war for looting colonies, extending spheres of influence, getting sources of raw materials as well as avenues for investment. And we must never forget that finance capital, monopoly capital, strives for domination, not for freedom. And that is the substance of the policy of imperialism, both in its external policy and in internal policies. Just as you have monopolies at home, you have monopolies abroad. Just as the bourgeoisie comes into a close alliance with the monopolies and works against the local population, it also works against the populations abroad. I'd like to thank the fraternal organization, Town Society, for this invitation to speak to you. And secondly, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time off to come and listen to me.